The ripple of forgiveness. The air was thick with the kind of summer heat that made the world feel heavy, like everything around you were pressing in. James Calder stepped off the train, his briefcase gripped tightly in his hand, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The city, once so familiar, felt alien today. The hum of traffic and the chatter of passers-by were distant sounds, like echoes from another life. He had only one thing on his mind, moving past the night that had fractured his sense of security and left him questioning the world he had once trusted. A month ago, James had been mugged in an alleyway 2 blocks from his office. The memory still felt fresh, vivid. He could still feel the cold edge of the knife pressed to his ribs, his heartbeat pounding in his throat as a stranger's hand demanded his wallet. The mugger had run off, leaving behind only the loss of a watch and some money. But the true loss, the loss of trust, of the quiet certainty that the world was a safe place, was far more devastating. Since then, James had become a stranger to himself. Every dark corner made his pulse quicken. Every unfamiliar face felt like a threat. Fear had taken root in his chest, and no matter how much he tried to push it away, it lingered. But today, something inside him had shifted. He had made a decision, a quiet vow: he was going to confront this fear. He would meet the person who had made him feel so small and broken, because it was the only way to heal. The police had arrested Caleb Vargas, a 19-year-old who had been caught in a desperate act. James had agreed to participate in a restorative justice program, a space where victims and offenders could meet, talk, and, if they were willing, heal. The meeting room was sterile, white walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, but to James, it felt like a sanctuary. A place where, perhaps, his heart might find peace. He sat at the round table in the center of the room, his hands folded in his lap, his mind swirling with questions. What was he expecting from this meeting? Redemption? Closure? Or something far more elusive, understanding? Moments later, the door opened, and Caleb entered. The young man was thinner than James had imagined, his face drawn with the weight of regret. His eyes flickered nervously between James and the counselor. He looked so much like a boy who had made a terrible mistake, but still a boy, just barely out of childhood. "Thank you both for being here," the counselor said gently, her voice soft but firm, the kind of voice that made the world feel less threatening. "This is a space for understanding and healing. James, would you like to start by sharing how the incident affected you?" James cleared his throat, his heart racing as he spoke. "That night changed me. I'm not who I was before. Every time I walk down the street, I feel like I'm being watched. Every dark corner is a reminder that I'm no longer safe. But the hardest thing, Caleb, is that I've been asking myself why did you do it? Why did it have to be me?" Caleb's shoulders slumped as he sat down, and James could see the weight of guilt pulling him down. The young man's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, his voice soft. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. I was just desperate. My mom lost her job, and we were about to lose our apartment. I thought if I could just get some money, maybe everything would be okay. I never thought about what it would do to you." James's heart twisted as he listened. He had expected anger, perhaps even bitterness, but instead, he felt something he hadn't anticipated: compassion. Caleb wasn't some hardened criminal, he was a young man who had been cornered by a world that offered him no way out. James saw himself in Caleb, in the fear that came with trying to survive, in the desperation of wanting something better but not knowing how to get it. He leaned forward slightly, meeting Caleb's gaze with an open heart. "Caleb," he said softly, "I'm scared of the way that night changed me. But I can see that you're not a bad person. You made a bad choice, but it doesn't define who you are. I want to understand you better. I want to know what led you to that moment. The words seemed to break something inside Caleb. His eyes filled with tears as he spoke of his mother's struggles, of being pushed to the edge, of feeling helpless and trapped. He told James how he had fallen in with a crowd that promised a way out, only to find that it led him further into darkness. He spoke of the weight of guilt that had consumed him since that night, and how he had never imagined that anyone would ever forgive him. James listened intently to the boy sitting across from him. It was as if he could see the brokenness in Caleb's eyes, a brokenness that mirrored his own. In that moment, all of the fear and anger James had carried with him melted away, replaced by something deeper, understanding. When the session ended, James stood and extended his hand. Caleb hesitated, his eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. But then, slowly, he reached out and took James's hand. The grip was tentative at first, but as their hands clasped, it became something more, something strong, something real. "I forgive you," James said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I forgive you, because I understand. And I hope you can forgive yourself too." Caleb's face crumpled, and he held James's hand tighter, as though he was afraid to let go of the one thing that had ever felt like a lifeline. "Thank you." His voice was shaking with the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. James's heart swelled with something that felt like peace. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight of fear lift from his chest, as though a burden he had carried for far too long had been shared. Over the next few weeks, James found himself thinking about Caleb more and more. He couldn't shake the image of the young man, so full of guilt and regret, trying to make sense of the wreckage of his life. And then, one day, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, James made a decision. He would go to Caleb's neighborhood. He would see for himself the place where Caleb had grown up, the place that had shaped him. When he arrived, he was struck by the contrast between the glossy downtown streets he had grown up in and the neighborhood before him. The buildings were crumbling, the sidewalks cracked, litter scattered everywhere. It was a place that felt forgotten, where hope seemed to have long since packed its bags and left. But it was here, in this forgotten place, that James would find his own redemption. At a small community center, James met Mrs. Alvarez, an older woman who ran a youth program in the area. She spoke with fire in her eyes about the challenges the community faced, how the children here had no place to turn, how the adults were trapped in cycles of poverty. But there was a light in her words, a hope that refused to be extinguished. James listened, feeling a stirring in his chest. He saw the struggle in her eyes, the tireless love for the children she cared for. And something inside him clicked. He knew he had to help. He had to give back, not just for Caleb but for the countless others like him who had been let down by a system that didn't care. Weeks later, James found himself back at the community center, sorting through donated books, feeling a strange sense of fulfillment he hadn't known he needed. He saw Caleb across the room, his hands moving quickly as he stacked chairs. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything felt still. "Mr. Calder," Caleb said, his voice hesitant, unsure if this was real. "Call me James," James replied with a smile. "I'm here to help, just like you." The days passed, and together, they worked side by side, organizing food drives, tutoring kids, helping to secure donations. The work was slow, but it was meaningful. And as the days turned into months, James watched Caleb change. He watched the young man transform before his eyes, no longer a boy in need of redemption, but someone who was starting to create his own path. One evening, after a successful fundraiser, Caleb pulled James aside. His face was filled with a quiet kind of gratitude, the kind that spoke volumes without needing to be spoken aloud. "You know," Caleb said, "I never thought I'd be able to do something like this. I never thought anyone would see me as more than the mistake I made. But you didn't just forgive me. You gave me a chance. I don't know how to thank you." James placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to thank me. Watching you grow, seeing the man you're becoming, that's the reward. Years passed, and the bond between James and Caleb deepened. Caleb enrolled in college, determined to make a difference in the world, to help others the way James had helped him. James, too, found a new sense of purpose, working at the community center, helping build something better. One day, as they stood together in the newly renovated center, Caleb handed James a small, wrapped package. Inside was a watch, not the one that had been stolen, but a new one, engraved with the words, "Time heals all wounds." James held it in his hands, tears welling in his eyes as he read the inscription. He looked at Caleb, the young man who had once been his assailant but was now a part of his family. "It does, doesn't it?" he said to himself, pulling Caleb into a hug. And in that moment, James realized the true power of forgiveness. It wasn't just about letting go of anger, it was about creating space for something better. It was about healing not just the wounds of the past, but also the hope for a future that could be different. James had found peace, and in helping Caleb, he had found something even more extraordinary, a love that transcended the pain of the past, a love that had the power to change everything.